The woman had been told to not eat the fruit. The man had said to her, God told us we can have everything we want from this garden, but we must never eat from that tree. We must never touch that fruit, or else we will die. And she did as she was told. Until one day, the serpent, slithering through the weeds, noticed the woman going out of her way to avoid that tree. And he asked, "Why do you avoid that particular tree?" And the woman said, "God told us if we eat of that tree, we will die, or even if we touch it." And the serpent looked at her sideways, which I guess is the only way a serpent can look, sideways. And he said, "Who told you that? You won't die. Your eyes will just be open and you will see how God sees." So the woman took this in, and an idea came to her head. She decided to investigate. She roamed the garden and she saw all the different trees and plants and all the different fruits, and she just started comparing and contrasting. And she said, "Gosh, this tree looks just as delightful as all these other trees. The fruit it is bearing is just as good as any other fruit. It is pleasing to my eye. God made it. It all seems like a blessing." So the woman crept close to the tree, and she touched one of the fruits in the branches, and she took it down. Nothing happened. She cracked it open, waiting for certain death. None came. And she kept comparing and contrasting and investigating, and eventually said, "No, this seems okay. This seems fine. This seems blessed. I'm going to enjoy this fruit." And she took a bite, and as soon as she did, her eyes were opened. She didn't die. She simply saw the way God saw, and she realized she was mortal. Just like the man, just like the tree, just like everything in the garden, it would all one day pass away. She didn't know that before. She couldn't see it, but now she could. And filled with that knowledge that her life, her time on this earth was limited, she thought to herself, there are things I want to do before I pass on. Let's get to work. And she went over to the man, and she held the fruit before him, and she said, "Look, I know we're not supposed to eat this, but I say to you, this is good fruit. Take and eat." And the man, being a man, didn't ask any questions, didn't investigate anything, didn't even think twice. He just said, "Great." And as soon as he bit into the fruit, his eyes were opened, and he felt afraid. And the two of them together were ashamed, until God took them and dressed them and blessed them and sent them out into the world to provide for one another and everyone else they would meet. We've all heard this story in one form or another. And for the last few hundred years at least, it's a story that is usually used to explain sin. This story has been told as a way of introducing a problem to our human condition. A problem we have been taught that only Jesus' death could help to solve. And that's one way of telling this story. Human, sinner, forever doomed until Jesus died on the cross and saved us all. That's one way of telling the story. But in order for that to be the only way to tell this story, you have to sort of willingly ignore a lot of other parts of this story. You have to willfully turn a blind eye to the patterns of separation and reconciliation that are already there in the story itself. God doesn't just set them loose and tell them that they're in trouble forever until a few thousand years later when Jesus comes along to bless them. God blesses them immediately. As soon as it happens, God puts clothes on them and says, "You have my blessing, go forward into this world." It happens in the same story. You have to willfully, if you're only going to see the stories about sin and damnation, you have to willfully see this woman as nothing more than a conniving and dishonest figure, rather than see her for the hero she really is. According to this story, it was woman who discovered free will. It was she who pioneered the human impulse to test boundaries and explore the unknown. To read this story as an explanation for human sin and a defense for seeing women as less than human, you have to intentionally overlook and devalue the story itself. The stories we tell are important. They shape us. Who we include in our stories shapes us. Who we exclude from our stories shapes us. The difference between intractable sin and abounding grace is in how we tell the story. The difference between a selfish predator and a selfless provider is in how we tell the story. The difference between a stranger and family is in how we tell the story. The difference between personal tragedy and living your life for a purpose that is greater than yourself, the difference lies in how we tell the story. On this Mother's Day, the way we think about mothers, creators, caregivers, providers, and the way we understand the legacy of which we are a part, it all depends on how we tell the story. In this congregation, our vision for the future is to build upon our strong foundation to help realize God's kingdom on earth. The way we are telling the story here is that God pours out love and life in abundance for all people. Regardless of who you are or where you come from, in this place, we seek to provide for you and empower you to provide for others, making God's presence known on earth as it is in heaven. To tell that story, we have to resist the urge to overlook certain people. In our telling of the story, our work cannot be completed unless we see all people as God's beloved children and we see their contributions as essential. At the very end of the book of Matthew, tucked in between the story of Jesus' death and the story of his resurrection, are two little verses that change our entire understanding of the narrative that came before. The author of Matthew tells us that apparently it has not just been Jesus and his 12 disciples on this journey from Galilee down to the cross in Jerusalem. Matthew reveals to us that apparently many women were also there. The group includes Jesus' mom. The group includes the mother of the Zebedee brothers, James and John, a woman named Mary Magdalene. All of them had been with Jesus and the disciples this entire time. What? How was this not a bigger part of the story? How did this not get included in the stories that we tell? This is an invitation to rethink and reimagine our traditional stories. Because while Jesus ministered to others, many women were also there ministering to him. There are multiple accounts of women coming up to Jesus in public and talking to him and asking to be healed or forgiven or for something for their daughter. And in that time and place, that is beyond scandal. That is a death sentence to speak to a man who you aren't related to. Maybe the only reason it was able to happen that way was because there was a group of many women traveling with Jesus and his disciples. Maybe they made it possible for those interactions to happen. There are multiple stories of Jesus and his disciples sitting down to table, and that's where some of the most profound teachings about what God's kingdom looks like, that's where they happened. They happened gathered around the dinner table. Did we even ever ask who was preparing those meals? I didn't. I'm an idiot. But apparently, it was these many women. Many women were there providing for them, providing these meals, setting up the table, giving them the space to teach and to heal, empowering them to do so. We're all familiar with the miracle story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with only a couple loaves of bread and a couple fish. Raise your hand if you're a lady here who put together a Thanksgiving dinner and had some unexpected guests. We have to reframe this story. How much of that miracle had to do with what Jesus did, and how much of that miracle had to do with the women who were behind the scenes, on the ground, performing miracles of their own, including these unseen women in the story, changes the whole story. It makes us realize that Jesus' work cannot be seen in its fullness without recognizing and naming these women and their contributions, which we can only guess at. Our vision for the future is to build upon our strong foundation to help realize God's kingdom on earth. And just as Jesus' story is incomplete without seeing the essential contributions of these many women, our vision of God's kingdom is incomplete until we notice the essential people who we haven't previously seen, to value the contributions of all people, to see every person and the gifts they bring as essential, even if they have not fit within our traditional stories. There's a nonprofit group called Forward Together. And for the last several years, they have tried to help expand the story of family and caregivers by celebrating not just mothers, but mamas. As they explain on their website, most popular images of mothers exclude mamas based on their sexual orientation, race, income, immigration status, and more. Mother's Day often reinforces traditional ideas of family and motherhood, and there's only one way to be a family. That's why we created Mama's Day, to highlight the contributions of the many mamas around us, and to work for recognition, rights, and resources for our mamas and families. After several years of intentionally changing the way the story of Mother's Day is told, after several years of intentionally seeing and including the people and contributions to caring for young people that do not fit in a traditional story, there was a growing awareness that many mothers are kept from being celebrated as mothers because they're in jail. They're not in jail for committing a crime, but rather working mothers who are in jail because they simply cannot afford to pay the fines on tickets that have been issued to them. Tickets for speeding, tickets for parking in the wrong places, but also tickets for things that I would doubt anyone in this room has ever received a ticket for. Tickets for loitering on their own property. Tickets for littering. And for poor working moms who cannot afford to pay these fines, they get put in jail until they are able to raise the funds to pay them off. But being in jail, you can't actually work to raise those funds, so that's where you go. "62% of all people in jail are there simply because they cannot afford bail." Over half of all people in jail are only there because they can't afford to pay their way out. And 44% of them are black women. Without ever being charged for a crime, hundreds of thousands of women are stuck in jail for days, weeks, months, years of their lives because our society values their financial contributions to the county budget more than we value their contributions as citizens, as women, as mothers. So this year, right now, many organizations band together for what they call Black Mama's Bailout Day. Organizations across the country have raised more than $300,000 for the sole purpose of posting bail for as many black mamas as they can so that those women can celebrate this Mother's Day with their families and celebrate the other mamas in their lives who help raise their kids when they can't. This is love in action. This is telling the story in a way that includes people who are usually unseen. This is a way of telling the story that honors contributions that are usually devalued. To see, this is what is required of us. If we seek to realize God's kingdom on earth, it is required that we see through the story the world tells that some people are just undeserving of human dignity, some people are just bad. It's required of us that we help to realize the way God built the world to be, full of grace, reconciling all human beings to one another. Friends, each and every one of us has been provided for in ways we can never know, by people we may not see. It was work that began before any of us were alive. It was work that happened when we were asleep, when we were sick, when we weren't looking, when we were undeserving. We've all been let down and disappointed by different aspects of our lives. Things don't pan out the way they're supposed to. People don't live up to who we thought they would be. In order to realize God's kingdom on earth, we need to see even these things as precious gifts. Every time an old understanding or an outdated law lets us down, it's an opportunity for us to provide for ourselves, which empowers us to provide for others. And that is the pattern I see playing out in this place over and over again. I see you caring for one another. I see you making meals and delivering them. I see you taking on a lot more than you should when your pastor needs to go out of town. I see you calling one another and sending cards and emails and visiting with one another. I see you going to hospitals and helping people get to their meetings on time. I see you feeding people in need. I see you weeping for people who lose children and lose homes and houses. I see you longing to include people who have traditionally been left out of our story. And this is the work to which we are called. To see essential human beings. To see people who have been unseen and are essential for our lives. I thank God for the blessing of doing this work with all of you. And I thank all of you mothers, and I wish you a happy Mother's Day. And I thank all of you mamas, all of you caregivers, all of you who provide for children, whether they are your biological kin or not. Thank you. Happy Mama's Day.